Good evening, everyone. My name's Angela Savage and I am the CEO of Public Libraries Victoria. You can probably tell I work for libraries because I'm wearing my cardigan. We're very big on cardigan pride in the library sector. I'm also an author and I'm also an interviewer, which is one of the best gigs around. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered tonight on the traditional lands of the Wagaya people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge that we're on the land of the oldest continuous culture in the world, which is something to be incredibly proud about and also to cherish. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight on behalf of the Reading the Mallee project and to introduce to you three fantastic crime writers who are all at different stages of their careers, but whose work is excellent and I can highly commend it to you if you haven't read it already. Let me introduce our panel. To my far right is Shelley Burr. Shelley grew up on Newcastle's beaches and her grandparents' property in Glenrowan and on the road between the two. Her novel Wake, you want to hold that up for us, Shelley, was a top 5 bestseller, won the CWA Debut Dagger Award in 2019, which, believe me, is a very big deal, was shortlisted for the Indie Book Awards Debut Novel Award, the Kill Your Darlings Unpublished Manuscript Award and the Bath Novel Award. Shelley also won the ABIA's 2023 Matt Rishall Award for New Writer of the Year for Wake. Her second novel, Ripper, and I have an advanced copy here, will be released in August. Shelley is studying agriculture at the University of New England with a focus on soil science. Please make Shelley feel welcome. And this is going to be given away reluctantly by me because I actually want to read it, but I am going to give it away tonight to the person who asks the best question when we move to audience question time. Thanks to Donata Carazza for making that available. All right, so you're on notice. In the middle, we have Garry Disher. Garry has published over 50 highly praised, prize-winning and wildly translated books in a range of genres: crime thrillers, literary and general fiction novels, short story collections, YA and children's fiction, and writers' handbooks. His growing international reputation has seen him tour Germany and the United States, where his crime and YA novels have appeared on the Best Books of the Year lists and won various awards. His latest titles include a literary novel, Her, the 9th Wyatt thriller, Killshot, the standalone crime novel, The Way It Is Now, and Day's End, the fourth in his best-selling and prize-winning Hirsch series. Please give a warm Ouyen welcome to Garry. And to my immediate right is Katherine Kovacic. Katherine is a former veterinarian turned art historian and writer of short stories, true crime and crime fiction. Her debut novel, The Portrait of Molly Dean, was shortlisted for the 2019 Ned Kelly Awards for Best First Fiction and is the first in a series of 3 novels so far featuring art historian Alex Clayton, most recently, The Shifting Landscape. Katherine is also the author of Miss Fisher's Modern Murder Mysteries, based on the TV show, and the historical true crime, The Schoolgirl Strangler. Her most recent work, Seven Sisters, was published by HarperCollins in January. Please make Katherine feel welcome. Now, fun fact, we have 3 doctors in the house. Myself, Dr. Savage. That's my Bond villain name, but it's true. We have Dr. Katherine, Dr. Garry, Dr. Disher. Now, Katherine's probably the only one who can help you with anything practical because she's both a vet and a PhD, whereas Garry and I can really only help you if you have an existential crisis while we're here. So, just, you have been warned. Anyway, we're here tonight to talk about genre fiction, character, crime, and place. Not much of a list to get through. Let's see how we go. All right, the 3 of you. Genre fiction, character, crime, and place. Which comes first for you, Shelley? Which came first? The crime, the genre, the place, or the character when it came to Wake?
That's such an excellent question, because if I had to put them in order, it was character first, because I do remember the moment. I mean, you could argue one way or the other. because I do remember the moment that I came up with the idea for Wake, and that was very, very deeply embedded in character. That Mina McCreary, the main character, sort of popped into my head. I was doing this deep dive. I wasn't intending to research for a novel or come up with ideas. I was just on one of those little obsessive rabbit holes, reading true crime forums. And I'd been on like a 2-week binge of them, and I'd started to get a little bit uncomfortable about some of the stuff that I was seeing in these spaces. It can at times become a bit of an echo chamber where you lose track of what's appropriate and what's normal. And so I was reading a discussion about the sibling of a murder victim, and what's he up to these days? He doesn't seem to have much of an online presence. I can't find any social media accounts for him, but he does have a LinkedIn, so I know where he works. And I went into the social media account of his employer, and I found their Christmas party photos, and I just remember having this moment of being so very uncomfortable with this, and thinking, if that was me, if this horrible thing had happened to me, and now these complete strangers felt entitled to information about me, I would be so angry. And that anger became Mina McCreary. So it was definitely character first. And from there, well, it needed to be a crime, because what crime had happened to this poor girl's family to put her in that position? And then setting. So when I came up with the crime, which was the abduction of a young girl, I thought I wanted it to be a setting that was very remote and isolated. Just this idea of just this house that was almost like a boat on the ocean, that it was so completely separated from everything, that the idea that someone could disappear from there and leave no trace would fascinate people to that degree. And so then the setting, it had to be rural, it had to be isolated. Obviously it was always going to be in Australia because, I don't think I have the skills to try and so deeply research in a way that needs to be to set it somewhere other than my home. And so rural Australia was where it had to be.
We might come back to that question later about how you create a sense of place. But Garry, I know, and you've written so widely, I'm going to ask you to focus on the Hirsch series in answering that question. So what came first, the crime, the character, the place?
Character and place together, I think. The setting of the Hirsch novels is the mid-north of South Australia, about halfway between Adelaide and the Flinders Ranges, which so happens where I grew up. I left there to go to Adelaide Uni and haven't really been back since, although I have family there. I go back at Christmas time. But the place has always exerted a tug on my imagination, and every few books I want to set it there again. So I knew I wanted to write, I was getting restless, I wanted to write about the place again. And I wanted a crime novel. A lot of crime fiction, the main character is firmly rooted to place. Like if we take Inspector Wexford in, is it Oxford, is it? No, Inspector Morse in Oxford, for example, or Ian Rankin's character in Edinburgh. They grew up there, the place has made them, they're familiar with the way it works. So I wanted an outsider character, and my character Hirsch, he's an Adelaide kid. He belongs to a detective, outer suburb detective branch, which is corrupt and is disbanded, and he's sent as a kind of punishment to a one-officer police station in the bush where he's a fish out of water. So there are two elements really that give me a very useful sense of tension. One is that he's new to the area, so he has to run two investigations, if you like. One is what makes this place tick, and the other is the crimes that he comes across, because he's often the first responder. And the second is that unlike a lot of crime fiction, he's just a lowly constable. He's not an inspector, or he hasn't got the rank, he hasn't got the authority, he hasn't got a team working for him. So those two things came together at the same time.
And it's interesting because each book he seems to deal with quite sort of mundane crime or order issues, as well as kind of big picture issues that are going on, which we will come to in a second. But first I want to ask Katherine that question. Which comes first for you, the character, the crime, or the place?
I think it's character and crime for me. So, and this particularly related to Alex Clayton because she is an art dealer, and the art world's full of grubby, grotty little corners that are full of crime. So the two really go very much hand in hand for her. So, and then having the qualities of a dealer for spotting fakes and frauds, for seeing those little clues in paintings that tell you there's something wrong with them, that works very well for a sleuth too. So those two simultaneously, I think, for Alex.
It's so interesting, isn't it, that there's no one formula, no one way of going about writing these stories and different gateways into the narrative. Katherine, I'm going to invite you to read a short passage from The Shifting Landscape to further our conversation about place as a prelude to my next question.
Okay, this is a section chosen by Angela. The vast blue sky arching over yellow pastures, dotted with sheep and the occasional stand of gum trees, reminds me of Arthur Streeton's Land of the Golden Fleece. He visited the Western District in the 1920s, the day when graziers were true lords of the land and Australians dreamed only of future potential and prosperity. Despite drought, foreign raiders and all the commercial pressures of farming in a global market, there are echoes of Australia Felix in the magnificent landscape spread out in every direction. As we speed towards our destination, I can see all around us the country that inspired artists and poets to create works that resonated with national pride.
It's beautiful. I love the way that so often Alex sees the world through paintings. It's a kind of beautiful lens to put on the narrative. But tell me about, just for the audience's sake, because I wasn't sure what Australia Felix was when I read it. I knew about the Heidelberg School and Streeton's paintings, but what was Australia Felix?
So Streeton obviously had a painting that he named Australia Felix, but the concept came from, I'm going to say, Thomas Mitchell on his third trip through Victoria in 1836. And the magnificent pasture land that he saw the potential in the Western District. So Australia Felix is Fortunate Australia, and he just saw such, potential for wealth, I guess, and prosperity.
And he's the one who the Major Mitchell cockatoo's named after.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, following on from that passage, what do you think makes the landscape quintessentially Australian in life as in fiction? Like, there's no doubt as to where these stories are set. What is it for you that firmly roots us in place?
Wow, that's a really tricky question. It's a combination of things. It's the light, particularly also if I'm talking through an Alex Clayton art kind of lens, it's that light that we have in regional Australia. It's the quality of that openness, I think, too, and the trees. That was something that was really interesting to see in early Australian art, the artists coming from a European sensibility and painting gum trees to look like oak trees, and then finally sort of embracing the landscape for what it was. And so I think part of what we have in crime is that, but it's also the vast sense of space, that openness. Even in art, we sort of saw a theme of the lost child in the bush and that fear of what's out there in the bush. And we have all those weird things like drop bears and bunyips and things too, just for the little creepy bits. But I think just there's still that sort of sense of the unknown about the Australian bush, I think.
Speaking of lost children, Shelley, so when you were writing the crime of the sister that disappears without a trace, were you conscious of writing to that kind of Australian tradition of the lost child in the bush?
Absolutely, and also somewhat conscious of some of the more questionable origins of that genre as well. There's a little bit of influence, and I'm the only person who can see it. It's deep in the foundations, and then everything else has been built on top of it. But there is a little bit of influence of Picnic and Hanging Rock on the book, and I definitely devoured that one before I started writing Wake. And there is always that consciousness that the landscape, particularly for someone who doesn't understand it, or for someone who isn't yet capable of understanding it like a child, is that it's very dangerous. And we have a property and we have a small child, and it is, even to this day, something that you need to be hyper conscious of.
And so do you think, would you agree with Katherine that sense of open space and that kind of uncontrolled kind of openness is part of what makes landscape quintessentially Australian? Or do you think there's other things, other factors in that?
I think certainly the landscape of that part of Australia, it's quintessentially open, and just that sense of vast distance. That was something I was trying to capture, of when you walk through one of those open paddocks and it's the sounds and the feeling, the sensation, the noises, and that awareness that you could be the only person for kilometres around you, and also the sense of danger that comes with that, that it is not quick to get help if something goes wrong out there.
Garry, how about you? So you've got an international readership for your work. Do you think there's an essential Australianness in your work which is part of, like, makes your work exotic for German and American readers? And if so, what do you think makes it quintessentially Australian in terms of the landscape?
There probably is, although I haven't grafted it on there just to please my German readers. But I've made 4 author tours of Germany now, and a lot of the readers there say it's the landscape that they like in these books. Because Europe is closely settled, it's green, the next village is half a kilometre down the road, that sort of thing. There's the sense of emptiness and isolation in the landscape of these books. They find it scary at one level too, because they see a lot of
horror movies.
Well, no, not only that, they see natural history programs on TV, and they think that Australia is populated with snakes and spiders. So I have to tell them that I can go years without seeing a snake. But I think what appeals to me about this landscape is the fact that I'm comfortable with it. It's where I grew up. I lived in Melbourne for many years. I've lived on the Mornington Peninsula now for 30 years, but I don't feel at home there.
Extraordinary. I suppose you're not yet a local, is that right?
Yeah, that's
to be
right.
around for longer than 30 years to be a local. I want to come back to place, but before we go back to place, I want to ask you about the crimes, because the crimes are really, really interesting in these books. And Garry, I'm going to quote you in the book, If I Tell You, I'll Have to Kill You, Australia's leading crime writers share their secrets. When you describe crime fiction as a barometer of social tensions, telling us about the world we live in. So I want to know from each of you can talk about the big picture social tensions that feature in each of your books, in these particular novels. And I might start with you, Shelley, and then Katherine and Garry.
Yeah, so I think one of the core things that I wanted to explore with Wake was some of these, the more recent cultures that we're seeing emerging online in terms of true crime. I mean, I don't want to critique true crime as an interest or a hobby. It's certainly one that I enjoy a great deal. And I also know that these amateur sleuth communities as well, they can be really positive places. They've achieved some really remarkable things. Some have fundraised to identify unidentified victims through DNA testing. There's absolutely a positive side to it, but with crime fiction, I think we're always more interested in exploring the darker sides of things. And so I wanted to look at that, about how it would feel for these people who have had something unimaginably traumatic happen to them, and also find themselves other people's entertainment. And I think that's probably the primary one.
Yeah. And it creates an extraordinary tension, because you've got like multiple narratives. So in the book, a lot of the chapters open with a kind of stream of exchanges on social media platforms, and it's deeply creepy. Very unnerving, alongside the main narrative. Katherine, what are the big picture kind of social tensions that you deal with in the shifting landscape?
Well, the shifting landscape, it's on one level it's a country house mystery in sort of the great British tradition, but it's set in regional Australia. And so there is the issue of primogeniture, who's going to inherit the farm, because if you've got multiple kids and you split up the inheritance, then the farm goes under. But then there's the question of who really owns the land anyway, because the property manager is an Indigenous man from the local people. His family, his ancestors fought in the war for Australia, but weren't eligible for soldier settlement. So that's really the big picture item, is who does the land belong to? And of course there's the painting, which is a Vongerat style house painting of the property in its early days, but also with Indigenous people in the painting. So that's the real undercurrent of the story.
And you've also got some tensions around the kind of notion of the survival of the family farm as well, with all the kind of economic pressures that are playing in terms of, you know, big agriculture, big business, all of that kind of stuff's happening in the background as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's a part of, you know, Alex is called out to this property to value the family's art collection, and finds that amongst various pieces ranging from absolute tat to reasonably mediocre, there is this one masterpiece painting that was previously unknown that could be sold and potentially turn the family fortunes around, or should it be kept because it is the one piece of family history that they'd all like to hold on to.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And Garry, just thinking about Day's End in particular, you explore some really interesting and very contemporary social tensions in that one. Would you like to describe those?
I should say that I've always been interested in prevailing social tensions in my crime fiction. The story has to come first, but for example, in my Peninsula police procedurals set on the Mornington Peninsula, I'm interested in the fact that the extremes of rich and poor there on the peninsula, and how all the old farmland is now taken up by housing estates with all the social issues that grow out of that. So with the Hirsch novel, first of all, Hirsch is a constable, so he deals with things like a dog that's missing, or the theft of some sheep, or whatever it might be.
Underwear off a clothesline, I remember in one novel.
But for many years I've been taking notes, and I've been very interested in the rise of the far right in Australia. And they're considered by the federal police to be much more dangerous than Islamic fundamentalism. The great fear, of course, is that there'll be another mass shooter like the guy in Christchurch in New Zealand. So I've been reading a lot about that, and when I read an article, I get a lot of ideas from newspapers about a far-right group in New South Wales buying a rural property so that they can do their paramilitary training unobserved. I thought, aha, why not have this in Hirsch's neck of the woods? So threaded through the novel are not only the danger of this fundamentalist group, this far-right group, but some of the offshoot philosophies and troubled young men who are poorly educated and there are no jobs in rural areas being attracted to extreme behaviour and attitudes and so on. So I filtered all the way through the novel.
It's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition of these big picture social tensions and small towns. And as you'd all be aware, I'm sure, that rural noir or small towns, big secrets type crime fiction has been enjoying a moment in Australia for some time now. I'd love to actually ask all of you what you think about that, and we might have a chat in the foyer after the session. And in fact, Garry wrote his thesis on this very issue. It was called The Search for a True Home, a critical review of recent rural noir, and probably fell on the floor when I actually said, I'd really like to read your thesis, because no one ever says that to anyone who's got a PhD. But I'm interested in your opinion, collectively, individually, of what makes small Australian towns such great settings for crime fiction. Shelley?
Yeah.
How do you account for the popularity, at least among writers? Well, I think among readers as well.
I think it absolutely is among readers. Like, there is a genuine hunger still for these kinds of stories. There's a genuine hunger for them to be told authentically. Yeah, it really is fascinating, because when setting out to write Wake, had no idea that this little stirring of interest was going on. It was exceptionally well timed. I participated in a program called Hard Copy in the ACT, and I remember seeing a speaker get up and talk about this amazing new genre that we were seeing emerging and how wonderful it was. And he called it drought noir, which I love as a name. I think it's wonderful. And I was sitting in the audience and I thought, wait a second, I think that's what I'm writing. And obviously, you can trace the origins of the current wave to Jane Harper, who is an incredibly talented writer and created an incredibly fascinating world in her small town. But if you look back through Australian crime as well, we've always been writing it. And I just think that the small town makes an intriguing setting, both because there's that sense of very tight-knitness, that everyone knows everyone else, and so anything awful that happens in a small town, it echoes through everybody, and it affects everyone in certain ways. And there's also a little bit of flexibility in the way that you can write those compared to, say, something that happens in the big city. Because police resources, they're stretched a little bit more. You may have your 1 or 2 police officer stations servicing massive areas, and so it just really is the perfect breeding ground for a noir story.
Interesting. Katherine, what about you? Because most of your books have been set in Melbourne, but you went west for this one. And what was it that appealed to you about that, even less than a small town setting, it's like a kind of homestead setting, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think part of the rural setting for me, and I guess this probably comes back from the veterinary background, is that there's more access to guns, there's more toxins and poisons and things that you can have fun with as a crime writer. There are places to bury people. So there's lots to appeal in country, but I agree with Shelley that tight-knit community, you can have secrets and people knowing there are secrets, and also in a way there's a little bit of a sense of isolation of the community. So you don't necessarily have to have a flood or a bridge out or something like that just to be confined to that area. And people know more about when people are in town, when they're coming and going and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it's places to bury bodies for me, really. And
Okay, Garry, having written the thesis on it, what's your take on this?
All I can do really is agree with what's been said. There's always been rural crime fiction written in Australia. It's having a resurgence now, I think, perhaps because it's reminding writers and readers that crime fiction does not have to be set in an English village or a big city. But yeah, the sense of a community under threat and its isolation, a community under strain, I think, is fertile ground for writers. But at the same time, these places aren't isolated. The drugs that the teenagers might be taking, for example, may have come from China. They're in touch, they have the internet, they're subject to prevailing forces in Canberra or the capital city, or the bigger city down the road. So they're both isolated and not isolated, and that's useful too.
Actually, really, that's one of the things I really admire about your books collectively, is that, these are not romanticised notions of small town life. It is small towns having to deal with contemporary tensions and politics and all of that kind of thing. It's not about places being frozen in time. And in fact, we're going to throw to Shelley in a moment, where she will read a section out of Wake that really captures that. But before I throw to Shelley, I was just interested in getting a show of hands from the audience. How many of you do enjoy reading small town noir or rural crime? Yeah, it's pretty good. And just out of interest, so urban crime, does that appeal to you, as many of you? Are you kind of... Yeah. Okay. Not quite as many though. Interesting. So you know where the body's buried. Right.
we're talking afterwards, Pip.
I just remember that ad campaign. Do you remember on the Gruen transfer where they asked people to make tourism ads that would keep people away from Australia? And there was, Australia and all of those great kind of landscapes. So many places to hide a body. I've forgotten that. So Shelley, I will throw to you. You note in your acknowledgements, and I always read the author's acknowledgements, one of my favourite parts of the novels, that Nanine, which is the setting for Wake, is a fictional town in a real part of Australia on the traditional lands of the Barkindji people, which I looked up is far northwest New South Wales on the Darling River. So tell us about your choice of setting and why did you decide to fictionalise it?
Well, the decision to fictionalise it was because it didn't feel fair to take a real place and put such a dark history on top of it. So I do tend to create fictional towns, and Ripper is the same, but I'm quite bad at geography. So it works much better for me to start with a real place and then put something fictional on top of it. So Nanine is very heavily based on the town of Ivanhoe in New South Wales. I really enjoy all the nods because it tells me that I probably didn't get it too badly wrong, like nobody looks horrified or mystified. And the same in Ripper is that I've taken a fictional town because I wanted to use a particular location, which is the midway point between Melbourne and Sydney, which is currently occupied by the town of Tarcutta. But I didn't want to take my horrible history and put it onto a real town. So again, I fictionalised it.
So let's read a little passage from your fictional town.
The street outside was washed with sunlight, but so empty. The handful of parking spots in front of the General had been occupied, forcing her to park up the street in front of the pub. There was no sign of the car owners. The pub and the takeaway wouldn't open until 11, and all the shops in between were long closed. That meant they'd probably parked there and left on the train when it passed through on Friday. Nobody parked in the train station car park tucked behind the row of shops unless they actually wanted to come back to find their car stolen or stripped down to its frame. Everyone knew any vehicle left there would be unattended for at least a week. Nanine had sprung up to serve farmers bringing livestock to the sale yards and grain to the storage sheds, but now the family farms were disappearing. Fewer people brought loads through, and with the sale yards closed, most of them kept going to the next town. The cargo trains blew straight through. The town had faded back to a few essentials, and its primary industry was stubbornness. Mina felt keenly every window she passed with the curtains drawn or newspaper taped inside the glass.
But lest you think it's all bleak, there's a passage preceding this that says, say what you want about small towns, but if you're one of theirs, they know when to huddle up and raise the shields. So how important was it for you in striking a balance between the pros and cons of small town life?
Very important. I think, we talk about romanticising small town life, and I'm probably, if it's a spectrum, I'm further towards the romanticising end, while still being fairly clear-eyed about the realities of some towns, especially, this is set in 2018. So this was before we knew when the drought would break. And the reality is that there are a lot of Australian towns out there that are struggling really badly. Any town needs an economic engine to keep running, and some of them have found new things. I grew up in Newcastle, which, as a teenager I would have told you would collapse within my lifetime, but now is this beautiful, vibrant place with an amazing art scene and very expensive houses. And, I go back and people say, did you grow up here? And I have to say, not here. I grew up in the town that used to be here. And so Nanine is very much that space, and, it is in a part based on Ivanhoe as well. I read a really beautiful article about the people of Ivanhoe that are still there and the things that they're having to do to keep a community functional. They fundraise to keep certain buildings maintained, and we're sitting in a wonderful example of that sort of community spirit. And so it's both hard, but there's something beautiful about it as well. It's stubbornness.
Yeah, I love that. I actually love that line about primary industry stubbornness. I think it's beautiful because it speaks to strength. Garry, you mentioned earlier that well, I don't know if we mentioned the name of the setting of the Hirsch novels, which is Tiverton, which is set on the Barrier Highway, blink and you'll miss it town. So it's also a fictional town set in a real part of Australia. What was behind your decision to fictionalise the towns, even though you've got the real place kind of surrounding it?
The town of Tiverton in the novel is made up of two real towns of Hallett and Booborowie. Hallett is where I went to primary school, and Booborowie, called Boob, of course, was where my parents retired from the farm. So I spent time in both places, and but that became Tiverton. But I knew for fictional reasons I might have to invent a building or an annual event or whatever that doesn't happen in the real place. I knew that if I called the place Hallett and they had a major royal show every year, or that there was a teaching hospital just down the road, it would confuse and irritate the locals. So I fictionalised it. That's the only reason is to give me freedom as a writer.
That makes sense. And also avoid those calls from people who go, that house is 2 blocks down from where you put it.
I used to get letters like that from a reader of my Wyatt novels. He said, "You've got Wyatt catching the tram at the corner of X and Y streets. The tram stops 200 metres down the road." So.
Oh yeah, never cross a tram, spotter. You're in for trouble. Katherine, the shifting landscape, as we've said, is set in Victoria's Western District. I suspect the actual setting, the family home of Kinloch, is a fiction, but your characters visit real places, such as Hamilton and Budge Bin. In fact, when we had our library's conference recently, we had a trivia question about which of the following 3 novelists sets their novel in a real place, and you were the answer. So there you go. So I'm interested in that balance. So is Kinloch a fiction?
Yep, Kinloch, absolutely fiction, yeah.
But you ground us very much in real places around it. What was behind those choices?
2 things. I think I like that sense of place. I know my readers tell me that they like that too. They like knowing the town that they're in, but also because I was setting the crime out of town on my fictional property, so we sort of had that going for us. But also it was particularly because of the paintings of Von Gerard. That was where he spent a lot of time doing all those house paintings, doing the magnificent landscapes. So for the veracity of the paintings, it had to be in a true landscape so that we could talk about how he'd approached it, how he'd approached the people, both colonial people and Indigenous people, and how he'd seen the land.
Yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. I've got so many more questions. I've just looked at the time and gone, oh my God. I'm going to throw to your questions very shortly, but I want to ask Garry first to read a passage from Day's End, and I'll ask one more question in relation to that, and then so you can get your questions ready. Just a quick reminder that a question ends in a question mark, and generally speaking, the question will be shorter than the possible answer that can be given. It's my hot tip.
I'll just preface this by saying that to me, the setting is not just a general area, but it can be a bed in a bedroom. That they all, settings are not static, they're dynamic. And I think we writers, manipulate settings to create moods, to influence characters, to influence plot and so on. This is Hirsch sitting in the police station is one room of a house on the highway, and he lives in the rooms at the back. Hirsch often asked himself, who am I here? What role am I playing? It seemed that sometimes a place determined who he was or was meant to be, and at other times he determined its nature and purpose. He was always being made and unmade. Take the little room that was the police station. When he was in there, everything about it said that he was a cop with a cop's authority. He answered work emails, his uniform cap hung from a hook, there was a wanted poster on the wall, and the public walked in off the street expecting him to be a cop. Yet sometimes there were breaches that transformed him into a different version of himself. Like yesterday, when he tossed out a kitschy postcard from his mother. At that moment, he was no longer a policeman, but an ungrateful son. To further complicate matters, he didn't exactly leave home to travel to his workplace. He simply walked through the connecting door from his 3 cramped rooms at the back of the building. And when he was in those rooms, he was not necessarily a man in repose, feet up, removed from work.
I love that. I actually have a confession to make. I teach writing about place. It's one of my favourite workshops to run, and I use passages from Garry's writing to illustrate for the students how you can integrate character and place and use setting to shed light on character, because you're so good at it.
Can I get a percentage?
No, but I could get a percentage of the sales that result from my wonderful promotion of your work. You actually coined a term in your thesis, which was the determinative role of setting. And I wanted to ask, just before we go to audience questions, very briefly, because I think there's a really interesting dynamic, Shelley, in your book about how the remoteness of Mina's setting impacts on how she navigates the trauma that she's experienced.
So one of the ways that Mina processes her grief is that she walks the landscape, and officially, well, she's quite secretive about the fact that she does this because she knows that it's extremely irrational. She's searching for her sister. And so I think that the remoteness of the setting it's fundamental to the way that the story unfolds and how it works. And it's kind of interesting as well that, like, at one point it was pitched to me about, like, potential adaptation of changing the setting to another country. And that was a really interesting question to me of, is it a successful story if it can be picked up and put somewhere else and still work exactly the same way? Or is it success to have so intensely integrated the setting and the story that wouldn't work at all and it would make no sense? And I still don't know the answer.
Yeah, great question. I guess you'd just have to experiment with it, wouldn't you? Katherine, I just want to, again, just quickly, before we throw to the audience, just your comments on how the setting impacts on the family dynamics in the shifting landscape.
What are you going to know?
Well, you've got a toddler who disappears as well, and again, we're ratcheting up the tension when a toddler disappears on a big homestead as opposed to the backyard, although we do know they disappear from backyards as well. And I guess, yeah, just that kind of thread and the death of the mysterious death of the patriarch that happens at the beginning. And I think the building itself is implicated in his death.
I think for me, place is almost another character, regardless of where we are or the story I'm writing. It's always a big, but it's a quiet character because it does play directly into the human protagonists, where they're placed in that setting, how they respond to it, and sometimes how that setting, as you said, with the lost child, responds to them in a way. So for me, yeah, I think that's probably that's the kind of answer you're sort of wanting. Yeah, and as you say, the house is, because in that book, the house is obviously, that's part of the property, part of what they could potentially lose. It's still got the good rooms, you know, where you bring the visitors, and then the rest of the house that's, you know, slowly descending into decay. But the family don't notice that because that's how they've always lived, you know, and that's why they don't notice that they've got a painting that's potentially worth millions because it's always been on the wall. Mm-hmm. So that whole sense of the immediate space and the broader space of the landscape really play directly into how the story unfolds.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, over to you for your questions. I'm sure that you've got some. If you raise your hand, Bridget will come around with or Emily will come around with my microphone. Hold on to it, I'll ask you the questions.
Hello, thank you. My question is, when you're writing, do you plot your whole story before you start? And do you write from chapter 1 through to chapter whatever, or do you start in the middle, start the end? How do you do it?
I'll jump in first of all. I always start at the middle and I work my way through. In terms of plotting, I know where it's going to end up and I know where I'm beginning, and I know some of the sites we're going to see along the way, where the bodies are going to be. But how we get from A to Z is often up for grabs. I have a plan in mind, which is like you know, when you've got the millways out, you know exactly where you're going to go to and you're going to drive straight there. And then at some point that damn GPS jumps in and says, in 200 metres turn left. And you go, "Ooh, do I turn left or do I go the way I think I should go?" And so sometimes we turn left and it's a complete, I'm not going to swear, it goes really bad and we ditch 10,000 words, and sometimes we've come to a really interesting place and the character takes you on that little side journey and you find all these interesting things. Maybe you kill someone else while you're off on the side, I don't know. And then you get back on the main road and head towards your ultimate destination again.
So it makes it a better story?
I think so. I think if I'm feeling surprised by my characters, then hopefully the readers are feeling surprised too.
Absolutely.
What about you, Garry? You're a plotter or a pantser?
Yeah, that's one of the big issues of fiction writing. Are you a plotter or a pantser? There's no right or wrong, of course. If you're a new writer and I say I'm a planner, it doesn't mean that it's suitable for you. But I used to write... I wrote a lot of so-called literary short stories and novels early in my writing career, and they were a voyage of discovery, really. The Irish writer Sean O'Phelan said, you need three elements: a character, a situation, and a promise. And that's how I would write these books. But then when I started writing crime fiction, it didn't work. I realised that if I wanted to stay a step ahead of the reader, if I was getting more aware of the undercurrents, I needed to plan, and so now I spend several weeks planning. But I always listen to the voice or the person who's tapping me on the shoulder and saying, he's not going to do that, he's going to do this instead. And I tend to listen to my instincts rather than be a slave to the plan.
So all those weeks of planning, do you have to do much for verification of what's actually happening, like for police procedure, all that sort of thing?
Yeah, luckily my brother, he's retired now, but he was a country cop, an outback cop too, so...
Handy.
Yeah, but like my father with the Second World War, there is stuff he won't talk about. But if I ring him up and say, Russ, is the back of the paddy wagon air conditioner or not? You know, he's good on that. And some of the police culture things, but not much. Otherwise, I just use Google.
What about you, Shelley? You a plotter or a pantser?
I'm very much a plotter. I like to start with, like I would call my first draft the plan, which is just to go through and do dot points of how the story plays out. And with Wake, I did that, and you know, it was about a 4-year process to write Wake. I did my first draft very fast, and it was exactly of the quality you would expect, pushing something out very fast. So there was a lot of rewriting and thinking about things and moving scenes around and printing it out and laying it all out on the floor and moving things around and crying and and then we finally got to a final draft, you know, and then, you know, after moving to publication, then the editors have their own views and things change from there. And so at the end, I would have told you that Wake evolved really significantly from that original plan. But the day that we went to print, I got nostalgic and I pulled that dot point plan out, and everything on that plot point plan matched the book precisely. It had not changed from that original plan at all. The ways that it changed, I ended up changing back, or it just sort of clarified things. It was really quite remarkable, and I don't know.
What can we say? There is no one way of doing it, right? Comes up time and time again. Great question. Thank you. Have we got another question? Oh, we've got lots more. All right. We're going to try and get through these 3 questions, but you'll have to keep them tight. You guys have to get your answers
very
tight.
quick. Just the influence of editors on your work.
I have a very good editor and I always listen to her. I had once had a very bad editor, and I complained to the publisher and they said they'd already sacked her. So editors are vital, I think, yeah. My editor likes to cut, though.
I like getting someone else's eyes on it, because you live so much in your own head with your own characters that sometimes you can't see that, even though it makes perfect sense in your head. They'll say, but I don't quite get what, and you, oh, okay, I have to just put a sentence in there, so you do get it. But at the same time, like Garry, I've had some questionable experiences, so I think there's also an element of pushback. I think one memorable one was, why aren't they listening to an audiobook or some music, while they're on this drive? It's like, they're actually on their way to kill someone, so it wasn't a very audiobook kind of moment. So yeah, sometimes you do need to push back a little bit.
Shelley, how about you?
Yeah, my editors are incredible. They've made the book infinitely better in every way. But it's very true that you can't just always do what the editors say. It still has to be your book, and you have to sometimes dig in your heels and say, no, it's this way for a reason. Sometimes I dig in my heels and then the next editor does their pass and says exactly the same thing. And so then I have to do a little bit more reflection. There certainly have been incidents where I thought the first one was totally wrong, and then when I heard it again and again, I was like, all right, maybe I am just being a little precious.
Yes.
I find with the editors as well, they're often excellent at knowing what's wrong, but I don't always find their suggestions for how to fix it.
Actually, I think
helpful.
a good editor will tell you something's wrong but won't tell you how to fix it, and will invite you to do the fixing. That's, for me, the measure of a great editor, when they trust you to do it, to find the solution. That's just my experience. We had another 2 questions over there. Oh, and 2 more over here.
Hi guys. First off, thanks so much for coming. It's such a good opportunity for our town and our locals, so really appreciate it. My question's a little bit selfish. I'm a teacher at the local college, as are many people in the audience, and there's so much that we teach when it comes to writing. What do you think the most important element is? Is it the structure? Is it the word choice, the setting, the characters?
Great question. Can I start?
Yes.
I have an answer for that. I think the number one thing that young people need to learn when they start out writing is about drafting. That the first draft is only ever the first draft, and that's where you get all your ideas on the page, and then you think about, okay, what's actually happening here? Have I got conflict? Have I got characters changing over time? But I think, that's one of the best lessons that you can get through to people from would-be writers from an early age, that your first draft is only ever your first draft.
I think that was a pretty perfect answer, actually. So I don't think we can elaborate on that. Does anyone want to add anything?
Gary's talked,
yeah.
He's probably got. Have you got a take on that?
I used to teach creative writing for years, and people would come to me saying, I want to write, I've got a burning desire to write, but nothing's ever happened to me. I've got nothing to write about. The American writer Flannery O'Connor said that we've all lived enough by the age of 20 for a lifetime of writing. So the great things of literature are the experience of love, of hate, of envy, of being betrayed by a friend. Everyone's been through those sorts of emotions, and they're
fear.
Sorry?
Overcoming fear is another one.
Overcoming fear. They're all worthy subjects of literature, so for people who are struggling to find something to write about, perhaps try to isolate something like when a best friend betrayed you, or whatever it might be, and getting in touch with that emotion can help someone get a start, at least. As long as they've got a distance on that experience, I think, rather than it still being too raw.
I think the other thing, Kate Kennedy, whose writing you would know well, says, and I think it's so true, she says, the creative mind loves restriction. So it's often better to, rather than saying, write a story, like Garry says, write about a time you were betrayed by a best friend, or a best friend let you down, or, write about something you're really scared of. and how you might overcome that fear. So actually giving them parameters, I think, also can be helpful in terms of making it more doable from a creative point of view. Sorry, a couple more questions. I'm just keeping track of the time.
Thank you.
We're going to go a little bit over, right?
One for Garry. Compiling a local history book, but want to tell the true stories, including photographs. How do you tell the truth without offending their descendants that might read it 70 years down the track?
70 years down the track. I don't have a ready answer for that.
Or what happened 70 years ago? You tell the truth, but you don't want to offend the readers now, I meant.
You don't want to offend the descendants, do you mean? Yeah. I think you just have to be true to the work, true to the story you want to tell. And if people are offended, if it's 70 years later, someone's great-grandfather did something 70 years ago, so what?
Just a quick ad. I wrote a true crime book a couple of years ago, and it was about a serial killer who was active in the 1930s. And I knew very well that he had a daughter and a granddaughter, but I told the story, and actually his granddaughter contacted me on Facebook afterwards, and she hadn't known about most of it until she was an adult, and her mother did not know that she was contacting me to talk about it, but she was pleased that she could get some of those details that she'd never been able to get through her family channels either. So,
good luck.
I'd firstly like to say thank you. In our library, I used to avoid the books that had a kangaroo on the spine, but there's some really terrific ones coming out now, and I've really enjoyed them. What used to put me off was the dialogue. How hard is dialogue to write? Because that's what puts me off, if it doesn't ring true, if it doesn't seem like a genuine conversation between people.
Great question.
yeah, I think once you get to know your characters, you know how they're going to react and respond. So sometimes when I'm sort of in the first stages of a character and I write it and I come back and look at it and think, oh, that's wrong, he wouldn't say that, because once I've written more of him, I know who he is and I understand him better. And I know exactly what you mean about some of those really, they jar on you and pull you out of the story. So I think that's it, it's getting to know your characters and understanding their story and their background, even if it's nothing that you're going to write in the book, just knowing who they are helps you write that voice.
What are your tips for dialogue writing, Garry?
I think I've got a good ear for dialogue, and I always have had, but I've always liked listening to conversations, to quirks of conversation. I worked in the university library once, and the woman who worked down there with me in the bowels of the library at Monash said, "She's as old as any old crow on the riverbank," and I thought, that's wonderful. So I used to make notes of those sorts of things, and my next door neighbour says things like, "The G car wouldn't start this morning." I think she means the goddamn car, but she can't bring herself to say "Gee, goddamn." So it makes you think too about the character who's saying that. So, but I used to teach creative writing, and I think a lot of my student writers didn't know how to use dialogue and avoided using it, or it was very clunky. Perhaps you can train yourself to be a listener, really. Because dialogue can say enormous things about characters. The things they don't say, you can reveal aspects of personality, of education, of their attitudes and beliefs. It's a very important tool in writing.
Shelley, have you got any hot tips for dialogue?
Yeah, listening to other people, absolutely, it's so important. There's one particular line in Ripper that I think I'm probably going to get bailed up about because it's lifted directly from a conversation that I was listening to, and it was just too perfect. I think as well, one thing that I find really helpful in writing is that I write by dictation, and that certainly is a bit of a shortcut to getting dialogue smoother because you are talking to begin with. And in the editing stage, it's really important to at least once go through and read the work out loud so you can hear how it sounds. And doing that, you will pick up really fast when dialogue doesn't really quite sound human. And so I think, yeah, you really do need to hear it to...
Absolutely,
Yeah.
great tip. We had a couple more hands up. We might only have time for one more question, I think, because we're over time.
We'll do it.
You can do it.
Quickly,
Do it.
while we're
All right.
talking about talking, basically, a question from somebody who had a ticket, couldn't be here in the end tonight. Audiobooks and how much input writers get into the people who narrate their books, how much possibly you consider audiobooks when you're writing.
These are all good questions, Donata. You've got a tough judging.
I don't consider the audiobook at all when I'm writing. I'm just writing my story. In terms of the narrator, I don't know how it's been for Shelley and Garry, but usually when we're getting to the audiobook stage, the company sends out 4 or 5 audition pieces, essentially people that they've shortlisted, reading a section of your book, perhaps reading something else as well. And so you listen to them, and I think for me it's always been, there's been an instant too that you can rule out that they open their mouths and you just go, oh, and then there'll be one that you think, oh, it's not bad, but then they'll read a certain sentence and they just kind of haven't gotten the story. Just from one sentence you can hear the inflections wrong or the emotions wrong. And so it usually comes down to 1 or 2, and then there's a bit of a workshopping about, well, we like this and we like that. So there's always that element, and then there's still always the uncertain cringe element of how it's going to sound when they read the whole thing. So.
My experience has been the same. I don't consider the audiobook version at all. And usually the audio publisher is different from your book publisher. Often the author doesn't have much say, but yeah, I have been sent clips by various actors who, between us, we've come up with actors, but perhaps your questioner, your friend, listened to an audio book and found that the the actor was quite unsuited to the novel. I don't know, maybe, because I think that does happen. I never listened to any of my audiobooks.
Do you have an experience with this, Shelley?
Yeah, so the Wake audiobook was a really interesting process because there is a certain amount of input, but it sort of goes author input is a bit of a wobbly thing sometimes. They came to me and they said, do you have anybody in mind that you'd really love to have do it? So I sent them some names and they're like, no. And so then they sent
Sorry, Ryan Gosling is not available.
So then they sent me some auditions to listen to, and one thing that I really wanted for Wake, because there are 2 points of view, is to have a male and a female narrator. That the female point of view would have one actress and the male point of view would have a different actor. And there was one actor in the audition tapes that I fell off my chair when I saw he was there. I was so excited, and he said no. So that can happen as well. Availability, people have other projects, they might just not be interested.
Yeah.
It's a back and forth. But I do consider the audiobooks when I'm writing. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and so, when you do pick up certain bugbears about how it comes across in audio. And so sometimes I do find myself thinking, all right, I need to put in a dialogue tag here because in audio it's going to be really clear that this is a back and forth on the page, but in audio, what's this going to sound like?
Nice.
And sometimes things in audiobooks, they'll just directly read out what's on the page, and it becomes quite annoying and repetitive with certain types of books. I was reading a non-fiction book that was doing this building thing of let's go back and slightly adjust it, and it did it 4 or 5 times, and I was going insane by the end. So, yeah.
Such an interesting kind of art. Look, I know there were some people who had their hands up. We're going to hang around for a bit longer. We've got a date at the Patchawallock pub for dinner, so we can't stay forever. But if you'd like to come Garry, Shelley and Katherine will be very happy to sign copies of their books, which Donata is selling at the back of the house, and you can also ask your questions directly to them there. Donata, have you got a judgment? Can you make a call on...
Yes, I'm making a call. Great questions and wonderful answers, but I'd like to...
Excellent. All right, congratulations. You can come and see me for Shelley's book. She will sign it for you. So look, this is like a 5-word answer from each of you. What's next? Shelley?
Ripper, August 31st.
Perfect, thank you. That's exactly what I want. Garry?
A standalone featuring a young female thief.
Oh, great. Love the sound of that. Katherine?
Another Alex Clayton and the start of a new series. This one's set in the Kimberley.
Fantastic. All right. Now, before we go, I've got something very exciting. Now, you'll all be familiar with the Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. But did you know that Katherine, in Year 8, wrote an ode to the Mallee fowl? And it's my pleasure to share that with you tonight. And this is fabulous.
What happens at the Roxy stays at the Roxy.
Yeah, all right. Oh, how I love the Mallee fowl. I think that they are great. The careful way they build a mound, then lay and incubate. The way they use the desert, their charm, their grace, their ease. The way they look at tourists who are spying from the trees. If you praise the likes of lyrebirds, I'll happily agree. But when you're gone, I'll smile a smile. It's the Mallee fowl for me. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Enjoy your evening.